Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we continue to have a look at the HSC option Improving Performance, and we're going to have a look at anaerobic training. So we're continuing to have a look at the focus question, how do athletes train for improved performance? And we previously had a look at strength training, aerobic training, and now we're going to have a look at anaerobic training as in speed and power training, and having a look at how do we develop power through resistance or weight training, plyometrics and short interval. So we already know a little bit about anaerobic training from our HSC Core 2, so we're just going to touch base on a few things that are a little bit different in the improving performance. Now, anaerobic fitness allows the athlete to quickly accelerate and sustain repeated high-intensity efforts with short recovery. So this is different to aerobic in that it's looking at short, powerful exercise. And there's two aspects that we need to look at here. We've got this aspect of anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity. Now, anaerobic power is the maximum rate of ATP that is produced by the ATP energy system. And so what we want to try and do is obviously train our body to produce ATP as fast as we can. When we look at the anaerobic capacity, this is the total amount of ATP which is produced by both our ATP and our lactic energy systems during high intensity exercise. So we're going to have a look at how we specifically train anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity a little bit later on. So how do we develop power with anaerobic training and in relation to resistance training? So power means exerting large amounts of force quickly. So like for example, we're sitting on a chair, getting up as quick as we possibly can. That's our body exerting power. Now power exercises must include some form of acceleration throughout the movement phase. Now this is different to strength exercise where it's focused on the deceleration phase. Now this is why machine weights or free weights are really good for explosive power, because it allows us to look at that acceleration in a controlled manner, especially when we're using machine weights. And so when we look at resistance training for power, we want to look at the load, or how much we're actually lifting, is about 20 to 50% of our 1 repetitions max. Now we looked at 1 repetitions max previously in relation to testing and strength training. Now, for a beginner, you're probably looking at 20% of how much you can max lift. And when you're moving into a more experienced athlete, probably looking at between 30 or 40 to 50% of that 1 reps maximum. And when we look at the actual program of what does our training session look like, when we're training for power, we should do 1 to 5 reps. So that's 1 to 5 lifts of that load, and we should do 3 to 5 of those sets of 1 to 5. And so when we look at recovery, we should be doing about 3 minutes recovery between each set. It's really important with power to ensure that it is fast. We've got to have that fast lifting, which obviously allows for that acceleration throughout the movement phase. The big thing here is that it must be controlled, and so obviously beginning athletes are probably more likely to use machine weights to control this speed, and a much more experienced athlete can use free weights because they've got strength and power and technique to actually do that with speed and still have the control. So the next type of training we look at for anaerobic training is plyometrics. Now plyometrics is basically explosive muscular contractions. And so it's looking at the lengthening of a muscle while it performs an eccentric contraction. So if you have a look at the picture down the bottom here, you can see that this person is jumping, going from a squat position up to landing again, and they're doing it quickly and strongly and by shortening the muscle through a concentric contraction. So we see that lengthening happening with the eccentric contraction, then we see very fast contraction happening with the shortening of the concentric contraction to allow for us to do repeated jumps. And so examples of plyometrics are things like leapfrog jumps or box jumps or stair jumps, all things that are looking at those explosive muscular contractions one after the other. Now, plyometrics are a really great way to develop anaerobic fitness, but there's some considerations that need to be taken into account, and a lot of this is based around obviously the size and the age of the athlete and their capacity at that point in time. It's also important to have a look at the athlete profile, so having a look at pre-testing the athlete and do they have prior injury, or are they suffering from any illnesses at the moment. That sort of thing is quite important to take into play, because that will have a look at, well, how many repetitions are you actually going to do. It's also important to have a look at the sport-specific needs of the athlete. So, for example, if your athlete isn't engaged in a sport that requires, power, explosive power within the legs, is it essential to be adding plyometrics to your training? Probably not. Now, it's really important when you're setting up a plyometric session in that you need to understand the concept of with increased fatigue. So once the athlete starts fatiguing, their technique is going to drop, which is obviously going to increase their chance of injury. So as a coach, it's really important to monitor technique and to monitor fatigue when your athletes are actually undergoing these plyometric sessions. Now, the sessions should only really need to have 1 to 2 of these sessions per week embedded within the regular training session, with the regular training program. And so what does this look like within a training program? For a beginner, you want to be having at least 100 touches per session. Now, when we talk about touches, that's like how many times your legs touch the ground. And so you want to look at, say, 3 to 4 different exercises with 2 to 4 sets of each exercise, and somewhere between 5 to 10 reps of each of that exercise, and about 2 minutes recovery between each set. Now, with a more advanced athlete who has been working on their muscular power or who has a lot more physical fitness, you can increase those foot touches to 140 to 200 per session, which means that they're obviously going to be able to participate for a lot longer time before they start fatiguing. They too should be looking at 1 to 2 sessions per week, and they probably should definitely be focusing on at least a minimum of a 48-hour recovery time from this type of exercise. Now, obviously, you don't want to jump straight from doing 100 to 200 per week. You want to progressively increase the amount of foot touches from beginner, say 100, to suit the fitness levels of the athlete. So finally, we have a look at anaerobic interval training. Now, we've already had a little bit of a look at this in Core 2, so we're just going to touch quickly on it. So anaerobic interval training basically means short bursts of high intensity with a limited amount of rest. We're trying to train our ATP-PC and our lactic acid energy system here. And so when we look at the aspects of an anaerobic interval training program, it's important to vary the time of the interval, as this is going to change the training effects. So depending on what you want to train for will depend on how long that interval is. And so if we're looking at the alactic system, so the ATP-C system, to work on alactic power, you need to be doing an interval for 1 to 6 seconds. For alactic capacity, so our capacity to increase the use of ATP-PC, you're looking at 6 to 25 seconds. Then when we look at moving into the lactic acid system and looking at the lactic power and lactic capacity, for lactic power, you want to have intervals between 25 to 40 seconds, and for lactic capacity, 40 to 60 seconds of duration. Now, the rest for these, as we said before, is short rest. And so we're looking at the concept of 1 to 1.5. So if you're doing a lactic power session where you've got, say, a 30-second interval, you're going to have a 45-second rest. And the aim of this is to try and increase either our lactic power or capacity, or our lactic power and capacity.